The draft notice arrived on a Tuesday. James Miller had been expecting it. All his friends had gotten theirs already. He was studying engineering at Ohio State, had a girlfriend named Sarah, and plans for the future. But in 1968, plans didn't mean much when Uncle Sam came calling. His mother cried the day he left for basic training. His father, a World War II vet, just gripped his shoulder and told him to keep his head low. "The jungle's different," he'd said, his eyes distant. "It's not like the war we fought." Basic training at Fort Leonard Wood was brutal but straightforward. Miller excelled at marksmanship, learned to field strip an M16 blindfolded, and made friends with guys from all over the country. There was Danny Martinez from New Mexico, who carried pictures of his newborn daughter that he'd never met. Mike O'Connor from Boston, who could make the whole platoon laugh with his Kennedy impressions. And Tommy Anderson, a farm kid from Iowa who seemed too gentle for what was coming. They deployed together in early '69. The humidity hit them like a wet blanket as they stepped off the transport at Tan Son Hut Air Base. Within a week, they'd lost their first man, Rodriguez, who stepped on a mine during a routine patrol. Miller helped collect the pieces they could find, and that night he wrote a letter to Sarah, but couldn't find the words to describe what he'd seen. The air smelled like diesel fuel and rotting vegetation, thick enough to chew. Miller's boots hadn't been dry since they landed, and already the jungle had started claiming their equipment. Green mold crawling across their packs, rust eating at their weapons' metal. Even the cigarettes went soggy, making every smoke break taste like wet paper and broken dreams. The weeks blurred together. More men died. Martinez took a sniper round through the throat while crossing a rice paddy. Miller held his hand as he bled out, watched the light fade from his eyes as he tried to say his daughter's name. O'Connor disappeared during a night patrol. They found his body 3 days later, stripped of weapons and boots. Each death carved something out of Miller. He stopped writing to Sarah, stopped thinking about Ohio State, stopped planning for anything beyond the next patrol. The jungle became his whole world, a green hell of constant rain, hidden enemies, and the endless wait for the next firefight. Anderson was the only one left from their original group. They grew closer, sharing cigarettes and stories during the quiet moments. Tommy talked about his family's farm, about the girl back home he wanted to marry. Miller listened and remembered what it felt like to have a future. Then came that rainy night near the river when their squad walked into a VC ambush. The world exploded into muzzle flashes and screams. Miller took shrapnel in his side as they scattered into the jungle. He ran until he couldn't anymore, collapsed in the mud, and waited for death to find him. He didn't know then that death would come wearing a face from his darkest nightmares. Night had fallen an hour ago, and the darkness was absolute. No stars penetrated the thick canopy above, no moon to cast its glow through the endless sheets of rain. The only light came from distant flares, brief, artificial stars that illuminated the jungle in harsh whites and reds before fading away. Miller hadn't moved in 4 hours. His squad had been separated during a firefight near the river, and he'd been running blind through the jungle until his legs gave out. Now he lay still, one hand wrapped around his M16, the other pressed against the bleeding gash in his side. The wound wasn't deep, but in this heat, in this wet, infection was always waiting. A branch snapped somewhere in the darkness. Miller stopped breathing. His fingers tightened around the rifle's grip until his knuckles went white. The sound had come from his left, maybe 30 yards out. Could be VC. Could be one of his own men. Could be anything. The jungle was never quiet, even at night. Another snap, closer now, then the soft squelch of boots and mud. He pressed himself deeper into the vegetation, ignoring the way the sharp elephant grass cut into his cheek. The footsteps were getting closer, moving with purpose, and Miller's heart hammered against his ribs so hard he was sure whatever was out there could hear it. A flare burst overhead, and for 3 terrible seconds, the jungle turned bright as day. Miller saw trees dripping with rain, saw the endless green that stretched in every direction, saw something move between the trunks that didn't look quite right. The darkness returned, but the image stayed burned into his mind. The shape had been wrong. Too tall, too thin, like a man stretched out on a rack. And the footsteps stopped. Miller held his breath again, straining his ears against the constant patter of rain. Nothing. Just water dropping from leaves and the distant thunder of artillery fire miles away. Then he heard it. Breathing. Not human breathing. This was wet, ragged, like something with damaged lungs trying to pull air through fluid, and it came from directly above him. Every muscle in Miller's body locked up, slowly, fighting against every instinct screaming at him to run. He tilted his head back. Another flare bloomed in the sky. The thing standing over him was at least 8 feet tall. Its limbs were too long, joints bent in extra places that they shouldn't. The skin was pale as a fish belly's, stretched tight over protruding bones. But its face, where eyes should have been, there were just deep weeping sockets. The mouth opened far too wide, lined with row after row of needle-sharp teeth. As the flare's harsh light illuminated the creature, Miller felt his sanity starting to crack. The thing's body seemed to ripple beneath its pale skin, as if whatever was inside didn't quite fit its human-like form. Its elongated fingers ended in yellowed claws that curved like scythes, each one as long as a combat knife. The creature's chest heaved with each rattling breath, its ribcage expanding far beyond what should have been possible, like a bellows pumping poisoned air. But it was the way it moved that truly horrified Miller. Each slight adjustment of its posture was wrong, jerky and fluid at the same time, like a praying mantis made of rubber and bone. Its head twitched in short, bird-like movements, and when it shifted its weight, its joint bent backwards, sideways, in possible directions. The smell hit him then, not just the copper-sweet reek of blood, but something deeper, more primitive. It was the smell of ancient tombs, of things that had rotted in the dark for centuries, of meat gone bad in the jungle heat. Miller could taste it on his tongue, thick and oily, making him fight the urge to gag. As the creature's mouth opened wider, a sound emerged that Miller would never be able to properly describe. A high-pitched keening that seemed to vibrate in his bones, mixed with a deep, wet gurgle that made him think of drowning men. A long black tongue snaked out, tasting the air like a serpent's. Strands of saliva dripped from its teeth, sizzling when they hit the leaves beside Miller's head. What it held in its hands, what was left of Tommy, twitched and jerked as tendons snapped and bones cracked. Miller watched, paralyzed, as a dog tag fell from the ruined mass, landing with a soft clink near his face. Tommy's blood had filled the stamped letters of his name, and the flare died. Miller bit down on his tongue to keep from screaming. The taste of blood filled his mouth as he listened to the wet sounds of feeding directly above him. Something warm and sticky dropped onto his neck. Each bite sent shockwaves of revulsion through Miller's body. The creature didn't just tear and swallow. It seemed to be savoring its meal, making soft, almost purring sounds between bites. Sometimes it would pause, and Miller would hear it sucking marrow from broken bones, the sound obscene in the darkness. The worst part was the intentionality of it all. This wasn't some mindless beast feeding on prey. There was an intelligence in its movements, purpose in its actions. Occasionally it would stop eating and cock its head, as if listening for other potential meals in the darkness. And during these pauses, Miller could feel its attention shift, like a physical weight pressing down on him. He knew, with a terrible certainty, that it was aware of him laying there. It was choosing to let him live. For now. For 20 minutes, Miller lay perfectly still as the creature fed. He heard bones snap, heard wet meat tear, heard things that would stay with him until the day he died. The whole time, that rasping breath never stopped. Finally, the sounds ceased. Miller waited, counting his heartbeats, praying to a god he wasn't sure existed anymore. The breathing moved away, accompanied by the sound of something heavy being dragged through the undergrowth. Miller waited until he couldn't hear it anymore, then waited another 10 minutes just to be sure. When he finally allowed himself to move, his muscles were so locked up that they creaked. He rolled onto his side, and his hand touched something wet and sticky in the grass. He jerked it back immediately. Another flare lit up the night. The grass around him was painted with blood. Pieces of uniform, American uniform, lay scattered in the mud. Dog tags glinted in the harsh light. The name was still readable. Anderson. Thomas R. Tommy Anderson. They'd played cards together just yesterday. Miller started crawling. He didn't care about the VC anymore. Didn't care about the war or the mission or anything except for getting away from this place. He crawled until his arms gave out, then pushed himself to his feet and started running. Behind him, somewhere in the distance, he heard that wet breathing start up again, and he ran faster. The thing stalked him for 3 more hours. Sometimes it would get close enough that he could hear its breathing, smell the copper-sweet stench of fresh blood, and other times it would fall back, letting him think he'd lost it, only to appear again just when hope started to creep in. It was playing with him. When dawn finally came, Miller found himself at the edge of a clearing. Through the thinning trees, he could see the shape of helicopters and the movements of American soldiers. Safety. He broke into a run, his legs shaking with exhaustion. Behind him, something screamed, a sound like metal being torn apart, like 1,000 voices crying out in pain. But when he looked back, there was nothing there, just the dark line of trees and the endless rain. The men at the base took one look at him and called the medics. Miller spent 2 weeks in a field hospital, battling infection from the gash in his side. When he told them what he'd seen, they blamed it on fever dreams, on stress, on the drugs they'd given him for the pain. But Miller knew what he'd seen, and some nights when he closes his eyes, he could still hear that wet breathing in the darkness, still feel those warm drops falling onto his neck, still see that twisted face with its empty, weeping eyes. And sometimes, in the deepest part of the night, when the Cleveland winter howls outside of his window, Miller pulls out his old maps and traces the paths they took through the jungle. His fingers follow the meandering lines of long-forgotten trails, touching places marked with careful X's, each one a spot where someone disappeared, where something inhuman left its mark. The paper has grown yellow with age, soft at the creases, stained with coffee and what might be tears. Or blood. After so many years, he can't always tell the difference. The official report listed Private Thomas Anderson as KIA, body not recovered, one of thousands lost to a jungle during that long, brutal war. But Miller knows the truth. He knows what really hunts in those dark spaces between the trees, what feeds on the fallen when the night grows deep and the rain never stops. And he knows why they never found all those missing men. 30 years later, Miller still wakes up screaming. The VA doctors call it PTSD. They prescribe him pills that don't help, and therapy sessions where he can't tell the whole truth. How do you explain to a civilian psychiatrist that the thing that haunts you isn't just the war, but something else that shouldn't exist? He never did go back to Ohio State, never married Sarah. She was engaged to someone else by the time he got home. The engineering degree he dreamed about became a job at a machine shop in Cleveland, where the constant noise of the machinery helps drown out the memories. But sometimes, late at night, his phone rings. It started in 1985 when they found what was left of a jungle crew in Cambodia. The official report blamed tigers, but Miller read between the lines. Bodies dragged away, strange tracks in the mud, survivors babbling about something tall and pale in the darkness. In 1992, it was a team of wildlife researchers in Vietnam. In 98, a group of tourists who ventured too far from their guide. Each time, the same pattern. Each time, another late-night call from someone who read his report, who needed to know what he'd seen that night in the rain. Local shamans burn special incense when the moon is dark, weaving protective spells that smell of sandalwood and fear. In remote villages, mothers still warn their children about the pale thing that walks in the rain, the hunter that comes when the night is deepest. They hang talismans of blessed bamboo above their doors, whisper in ancient prayers, and keep their children close when the monsoons come. Miller keeps a folder, newspaper clippings, blurry photographs, coordinates marked on maps. The thing has a hunting ground that stretches across Southeast Asia, following the old battlefields like a ghost of the war itself. Some nights he spreads the evidence across his kitchen table and tries to make sense of it all. But he's not the only one who's seen it. There are others, soldiers from both sides of the war, civilians, locals who've known about it for generations. They find each other eventually, sharing stories in hushed voices over secure phone lines and in private chat rooms. The Vietnamese call it the Night Hunter. The locals say it's always been there, feeding on the dead of countless wars. First the French, then the Americans, then anyone unlucky enough to wander into its territory. Just last week, Miller got another call. A development company is planning to clear part of the jungle where his unit was ambushed. They're going to build a resort, swimming pools and tennis courts where men once bled and died. He's bought a plane ticket to Saigon, The doctors tell him it's a bad idea, that returning to Vietnam will only trigger more trauma. They don't understand that he's not going back to face his fears. He's going back to warn them, because he knows what will happen when the bulldozers disturb that dark earth, when the chainsaws wake something that's been waiting in the shadows. He knows what hunts in those trees. And this time, he's not running away. The night before his flight, Miller visits Tommy Anderson's grave in Iowa. The headstone reads, "In memory of," because they never found enough of him to bury. The small American flag planted beside it has faded in the sun, its colors washed out like old bloodstains. Miller kneels in the wet grass, places a hand on the cold stone, and makes a promise he knows he might not live to keep. But promises are all he has left now. Promises and bullets, and the weight of 30 years' worth of nightmares pressing down on his shoulders. In his bedroom closet behind the boxes of VA paperwork and old uniforms he can't bring himself to throw away, there's a locked case. Inside is an M16. Not the same one he carried in the war, but it was close enough. The weight is familiar in his hands as he breaks it down, cleans each part, reassembles it in the dark, just like they taught him at Fort Leonard Wood all those years ago. He's too old for this. His hands shake sometimes, and his bad knee aches when it rains. But he owes it to Tommy Anderson, to Martinez and O'Connor, and all the others who never made it home. He owes it to the thing's future victims, who don't yet know what waits for them in the darkness. And tomorrow he'll board a plane. In 48 hours, he'll be back in the jungle. And this time, when he hears that wet breathing in the darkness, he won't be alone and afraid. This time, he'll be ready. Because some wars never end, some enemies never die, and some debts can only be paid in blood.